So one of the things that people get confused on is the difference between idiopathic intracranial hypotension, which is my preferred term for the idiopathic causes of high intracranial pressure, intracranial hypertension, and pseudotumor cerebri. And the reason there's confusion is pseudotumor cerebri just means there's no tumor in your brain. However, there are non-idiopathic causes of intracranial hypertension which can look just like pseudotumor cerebri, and so I call those secondary pseudotumor cerebri. And one of the things that you need to know is the modified Dandy criteria require that we have an imaging study, so MRI plus MR venogram to make sure there's not sinus thrombosis, but you need that lumbar puncture. And it's not just to measure the elevated opening pressure, you have to check the CSF contents, because it could be meningitis if the white cell count is elevated, or inflammatory disease in the meninges. Doesn't have to be infectious, but if the protein is elevated, that elevated protein alone can result in papilledema and intracranial hypertension. When you have a CSF that has a marked xanthochromia, it's like very, very dark brown, looks like Coca-Cola, and you have big protein, this is called the Froin Syndrome when it causes what looks like pseudotumor cerebri. And the reason it's dangerous is, just like in pseudotumor cerebri from the idiopathic variety, the MRI and MR venogram of the head in the Froin syndrome is negative because it's not a head problem. So in the Froin syndrome, the head imaging is negative, the CSF protein is elevated, the CSF is xanthochromic, and the imaging study that we must do now is a spine imaging study, because what we're looking for is a tumor in the spine, and it's often schwannoma or ependymoma. So spinal tumors can cause secondary pseudotumor cerebri, even though it's a real tumor in your spine. And imaging the head might miss it, and the mechanism is the CSF outflow of the arachnoid granulations is blocked, either by hemorrhage or protein or inflammatory cytokines or whatever that's in that CSF. And so it causes increased intracranial pressure even though the lesion is in the spine. The other way that the Froin can come to you, however, is like a dry tap, and that is completely counterintuitive. So if you put the spinal meter under or at the level of the tumor, no CSF will come out. And so some people call this a pseudo-Froin syndrome because you actually don't have the tap. So a Froin syndrome or a pseudo-Froin syndrome can cause increased intracranial pressure mimicking pseudotumor cerebri. And in a dry tap, we're going to be worried that the tumor itself in the spine is obstructing the flow of CSF. And so we have to image the spine both in a dry tap and an elevated CSF protein in intracranial hypertension, because that's not meeting the modified Dandy criteria because the CSF is actually abnormal. Froin syndrome, high protein, blocks the arachnoid granulation. Pseudo-Froin, dry tap, obstruction by the tumor keeps you from getting any fluid. And both Froin and pseudo-Froin can mimic pseudotumor cerebri.